Okay, today, 26th May, I return again to the perennial topic of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine, which continues to be the main catalyzing conflict in shaping the global situation. Though, of course, the conflict in the Middle East also remains extremely important, and looming over the horizon is the next big possible conflict, the conflict between the United States and China in the Pacific region, in the Taiwan Straits, and in the South China Sea. But let's first of all discuss the situation in Ukraine. And today I'm going to do that which I traditionally do, at least in most programs, and that is first touch on the military situation as I understand it on the battlefronts, because of course it is this situation that continues to shape the overall situation in the diplomatic and political and economic aspects of the crisis. So let's start with the military situation. Now, yesterday, the Russians launched a major missile strike against Ukraine, and it was a missile strike that involved Uranium-2 drones and Kh-101 subsonic cruise missiles and Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. At least those are the missiles that the Ukrainians are talking about. They claim, the Ukrainians do, that they shot down all 12 of the Kh-101 missiles that were launched, and they also claim that they shot down all the Uranium-2 drones that were launched, but they admit that they were unable to shoot down the Kinzhal hypersonic missiles because, as they like to say, they are now short of Patriot missiles. Now, the numbers they give are 12 Kh-101s, all of which were shot down, 32 drones, Uranium-2 drones, and 2 Kinzhal missiles, both of which got through. Now, the Russians, for their part, have not yet given their full explanation and account of the missile strike. We'll have to wait for that by tomorrow. And of course, as of the time of speaking, I am not in a position to second guess the Ukrainian numbers, though I have never found them remotely plausible, either during the present time, during the current period of the conflict, or during the winter of 2022-2023, when the Ukrainians were repeatedly claiming to shoot down 90% or more of the Russian missiles launched against them, even as damage on their energy system, which was at that time the primary target, mounted. But anyway, let's make one point. I'm going to make one particular point, which is that yesterday I was seeing reports that around 10 Tupolev 95 bombers were in the air, and that Tupolev 22M3 bombers had also taken off. Now, the Tupolev 95 bombers are the bombers that launch the Kh-101s. If the real number of bombers that took off was 10, then it's most unlikely that only 12 of these missiles were in fact launched, because as I understand it, Tupolev 95 bombers can carry several of these missiles, and it's more likely that the total number was significantly greater. That's the first thing to say. Now, the typical missile launched by the Tupolev 22M3 is the gigantic Kh-22 or 32 anti-ship missile, which the Russians have been using to devastating effect in a ground strike role. And interestingly, the Ukrainians are saying absolutely nothing about that missile. Now, there have been reports that the Tupolev 22M3 has also been adapted to launch the Kinzhal hypersonic missile. Though I wonder whether that is actually correct, because I understand that the nature of the Kinzhal missile requires it to be launched at very high speeds and at very high altitudes, which determines the choice of the launch vehicle, which is the specialized MiG-31 fighter bomber. Perhaps the actual missile, the actual hypersonic missile that the Tupolev 22 M3 is really being adapted to launch is the Zircon hypersonic missile, which is a cruise missile which operates in a completely different way and which does not require the special type of launch vehicle that the Kinzhal does. Anyway, I mention all of this because, again, as I've said, I'm skeptical about these Ukrainian claims. But I cannot, as of now, say that they are untrue. Now, what exactly did the Russians attack? They appear to have attacked many facilities in many different parts of Ukraine, in Kiev, in central Ukraine, places like Zhytomyr. The number of targets struck, or at least targeted, is so great that it does seem to me as if many more missiles were used in this strike than the Ukrainians are admitting to. And one particular target appears to have been the major airfield built by the Soviet Union in the town, the central Ukrainian town of Starokonstantinov. Now, again, during the Cold War, I remember hearing an awful lot about this particular airfield because this is where the Soviets based large numbers of their Sukhoi 24 strike bombers, their equivalent of the Tornado strike bomber, tactical bomber of the British and German air forces. And this, I can remember in some media outlets in the West at that time, the Daily Express and the Daily Mail and all of that, made Starokonstantinov a place of fear. Now, today, it seems that the numbers of Sukhoi 24s that remain in Starokonstantinov is very few, probably in the single figures. These are the launch carriers for the Storm Shadows, of which we've been hearing significantly less of late. The Russians have been hunting them for a very long time. I doubt that it is in order to destroy the few remaining Sukhoi 24s that the Russians will have attacked Starokonstantinov. Suffice to say that it is a massive airbase constructed by the Soviet Union. It has a long runway. Presumably, it is the runway that will be used, amongst others possibly, by the F-16s if and when they ever arrive in Ukraine. And I suspect that the Russians who have attacked Starokonstantinov on several occasions attacked it again in order to destroy this particular airfield, or at least to do damage to it, to delay again the deployment of the F-16s. The Ukrainians will have to do repairs, and those repairs will take time, and we will see how and whether this actually delays deployments of the F-16s. Anyway, as well as Starokonstantinov, I'm hearing reports that more parts of Ukraine's increasingly broken down energy system were attacked yesterday, last night, though again, I have no details. And according to one Russian commentator, who appears to be getting his information from an official source, there was a major strike on a major warehouse in the city of Dnipro, and this targeted and supposedly destroyed a warehouse where the ATACMS missiles, which Ukraine has been stockpiling in the area of the line of contact with a view to launching strikes against Russian territory where those ATACMS missiles supposedly were located. Well, again, I have no way of knowing whether or not that is true. Tomorrow, the Russian Defense Ministry will provide its brief, concise account of this missile strike. It will provide us, presumably, with some information, and I'm going to wait for what the Defense Ministry says and what the video and other evidence tells us before revisiting the question of what, if anything, this missile strike achieved. Now, for the record, Ukraine does seem to have launched its own missile strike against Crimea. Again, this appears to have involved ATACMS missiles. I believe 5 of them were launched, or at least so the Russian Defense Ministry is saying. And according to the Russian Defense Ministry, all of them were shot down. Again, we'll see whether or not that is true. No doubt over the next couple of hours, we will be getting more information. So anyway, that is part of what happened last night. Missile strikes by each side against the other. A powerful Russian missile strike, but one which we don't have sufficient details about. The Ukrainians launching a missile strike of their own. We don't have many details of that either, but according to early reports, it seems as if that Ukrainian missile strike might not have been successful. But again, we'll have to wait and see. Now, I said that the ATACMS missiles that had been supposedly or allegedly destroyed in that warehouse in Dnipro were intended for strikes against targets inside pre-2014 Russia. Now, of course, that is my own speculation, but that seems to me far and away the most likely purpose of these missiles. And I do want again to revisit this issue because there have been several attempts, I've noticed by various commentators, to play down the significance of these of this issue of the Americans green lighting weapon strikes by the Ukrainians on Russian territory. And several people have been saying, and I think with some, well, quite correctly, that the reality is that Ukraine has been launching attacks on Russian territory using American weapons for a very long time. They've been shelling positions in Belgorod. American infantry fighting vehicles have participated in those attacks. And of course, alongside those American systems, it's also true that Vampir multiple launch rocket systems supplied by the Czech Republic have also been used, and they have fired unguided rockets into Russia, doing significant damage to Belgorod and to other places inside Russia. And people are saying, well, you know, what's the difference? The Ukrainians have been launching drone attacks right across Russia. The Ukrainians have been launching rocket attacks with Czech-supplied multiple launch rocket systems. The Ukrainians have crossed the border with Stryker wheeled infantry fighting vehicles, and they've shelled Russian positions along the border with American M777 howitzers and M109 Paladin self-propelled howitzers. So what really is going to change? I think this is far too complacent a view myself. Notice that these discussions about launching strikes by Ukraine inside Russian territory have come weeks after, just a few weeks after, the confirmed delivery of ATACMS missiles to Ukraine by the United States. And I have absolutely no doubt, none at all, that the intended system for carrying out further strikes on Russian territory is the ATACMS, and eventually, if and when Chancellor Scholz changes his stance, the Taurus missiles, which have an even longer range. And I'm going to suggest that there is a fundamental difference between attacks by minor drones, small drones, which can only do minor damage, multiple launch rocket systems, however modern, like the Czech Vampires, which launch unguided rockets, sporadic shelling of positions by tube artillery. There's a fundamental difference between all of that and missile strikes, guided missile strikes carried out by long-range supersonic and subsonic cruise missiles, or ballistic missiles in the case of the ATACMS, launched against Russian territory. That is something completely different from anything we have seen up to now in this war. Certainly, the Ukrainians have tried to do things like that themselves. They tried to convert the Yastreb jet-powered drone into a kind of crude supersonic cruise missile. I think overall the attempt was unsuccessful. I don't think there's any real comparison between the converted Yastreb Soviet-era drones and much more modern, far more powerful systems like the Taurus and the ATACMS. The Russians will see that as a threat, and they've made that very clear. They called in the British ambassador after David Cameron appeared to endorse the Ukrainian decision, or the Ukrainian wish rather, to use Storm Shadow, British supplied Storm Shadow missiles in attacks on Russian territory. And the Russians gave clear warning that for them that was a red line and would invite retaliation. Putin has spoken about that very same thing himself in various speeches and public comments which he has made. And if the West crosses that kind of red line, then I have no doubt at all that the Russians will respond. Now, Sergei Lavrov has been speaking about this. He talked about this over the course of a brief press conference that he gave in in Minsk, where he was present alongside Putin over the course of this summer meeting between Putin and President Lukashenko of Belarus. And the quoted part of this press conference on the Foreign Ministry's website is very short, but I will read it, and it confirms, it shows that the Russians believe that the decision to greenlight missile strikes on their territory with Western missiles, ATACMS, Storm Shadows, probably eventually Taurus missiles, that it has already been made. And Lavrov is quoted by the Russian Foreign Ministry as saying this. Question: how would you comment on House Speaker Mike Johnson's statement about the use of US-supplied weapons to strike Russia? And then Lavrov replied with these words. They said for a long time they were not supporting it. They also said they did not allow it and advised Ukraine against using it. But in fact, they are waging war against us. American weapons have already been used to strike various targets outside the conflict zone. Washington is trying to make reassuring statements for the local public or for NATO members to pretend the decision has not yet been made. It is a trick. We are certain that American and other Western supplied weapons are being used to strike targets on Russian territory, primarily civilian infrastructure and residential areas. They are responsible for what these weapons have done. So he's already saying that the Russians believe this decision has already been made. They are linking it to the previous attacks on their towns and cities in Russia, Belgorod and the others. And they are also saying that they are, in fact, waging war against us. They're waging war against us. And today, Lavrov is quoted as saying something else, and he's gone further. Now, I'm not exactly sure exactly in what context he said what I'm about to say, but he's apparently given another interview, and the RIA Novosti news agency reports him as saying the following: talks in the West about allowing Kiev to conduct strikes with US weapons on Russia reflects desperation and an understanding that they will not achieve their goals by using the usual honest means, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on Sunday. Russia has shown the West that it will not tolerate attempts to use Ukraine as a threat to Russia's security and as a tool to destroy everything Russian in the historic Russian lands. After that, Western countries began to make decisions, including on supplying Kiev with weapons. As I understand it, these conversations reflect, in a sense, a desperation and a realization that by the usual honest means that apply in international law, even in times of hostilities, they will not achieve their goal. It feels like agony. So what Lavrov is saying here is that the West is becoming increasingly desperate. It can see that Ukraine is losing the war, and for that reason, they're taking ever more reckless steps, like green-lighting this policy of publicly allowing Ukraine to strike at targets inside pre-2014 Russia, including with American weapons, including by definition the ATACMS missiles. And I think the Russians think that in fact this is the reason why the ATACMS missiles were ultimately supplied. Partly it is intended, of course, to try to destroy the Crimean Bridge. This has been talked about many times. It looks as if the United States and Ukraine are coming to a gradual realization that using ATACMS missiles to destroy the Crimean Bridge is going to be very difficult. Russian air defenses are proving effective in countering the ATACMS missiles across Crimea. Every so often missiles do get through and they do damage, but overall attacking a vast structure like the Crimean Bridge might be very challenging. I think that is what Lavrov was talking about when he talked about using these systems to attack civilian air infrastructure, because as far as the Russians are concerned, the Crimean Bridge is, of course, first and foremost and primarily civilian infrastructure. But I think that what Lavrov is also hinting at, and what he is thinking, and I think what the Russians are also thinking, is that the decision by the United States to start supplying ATACMS missiles, which was finally made in February, is a reflection of growing Western panic, specifically panic within the Biden administration at the progress of the current Russian offensive, and that it has tilted the balance towards the hardliners, people like Blinken and Victoria Nuland and the others, who want a missile offensive against Russia in the belief that it will be this that will eventually bring the Russians to heel and force them to accept peace on American terms. And Lavrov clearly believes that that decision has already been made, and he is making it clear again that the Russians will respond. Russia has shown the West that it will not tolerate attempts to use Ukraine as a threat to Russia's security and as a tool to destroy everything Russian in historic Russian lands. Now, I think Lavrov is partly right, and I'm sure that these strikes are going to come. I think the Russians, as Putin also said when he was in Minsk, will still want to prevent an uncontrolled escalation. After all, they are winning the war, so why should they do things that are reckless and which might invite Western retaliation? But Putin again, whilst he was in Minsk, pointedly reminded everybody about the exercises underway with the tactical nuclear weapons. He confirmed that they're extending to cover Belarus, and he said, of course, that these are scheduled drills. But again, he did, as the Defense Ministry has done in the past, he did once again pointedly remind people of them. So, over the course of this visit, he again made it clear, however, that the Russians will protect their territory and that they have always done so. And I don't think we should take these Russian statements, these Russian concerns and statements and warnings complacently. Now, Putin, however, did, as I said, make it clear that the Russians are not looking for an uncontrolled escalation. I don't for a moment believe, for example, that they intend to reciprocate with missile strikes against the continental United States. But, as I've said in previous programs, they don't need to. There are lots of places around the world where they can target American military facilities. There are lots of players around the world who would probably be only too delighted to act as Russian proxies in launching those kind of attacks. And of course, the Middle East in particular presents ample opportunities. So let's be careful and let's not be complacent about this issue. I don't think that there are any grounds to be. And I remain of the view that the Biden administration is indeed gambling increasingly recklessly about the West's and the US's security. Now, I'll finish by saying on this specific topic that Radek Sikorski, Poland's foreign minister, has again said that if the Russians drop or use tactical nuclear weapons somewhere in the conflict zone in Ukraine. The United States has warned the Russians that they will attack by conventional means and destroy the entire Russian military across Ukraine. I don't believe that warning has been given, and I don't believe it has been given for one overwhelmingly simple reason. I have come to the conclusion that it can't be done. I have seen many claims about the mighty power of the US Air Force in Europe. I've read many reports about the other weapon systems that the United States has in Europe. I've had many discussions with many people, including people from the military, Western militaries, on this precise issue. I think that the Americans do not have that level of capability. I think that they know they don't. I think that the Russians know they don't. And I'm quite firmly convinced that because of all of that, that kind of warning has never been made. And what Sikorsky is saying are things that others have said before. I believe that if such a warning had been made by the United States, we would have a lot more information about it than these claims made by people like Radek Sikorsky, who I think can be safely ignored on questions like this. Anyway, that's the question of the missile strikes. Let's now turn to the situation on the contact line. And here I'm going to start with Kharkiv region, because I've spoken already about the massive pile-up of forces that has taken place, Ukrainian forces, that has taken place in Kharkiv. The best estimate I've seen, or what looks to me like the best estimate I've seen, about the total number of Russian troops operating across the border inside Ukraine in Kharkiv region is 15,000, around the strength of a typical Russian division, supplemented maybe with some reinforced division, supplemented with troops of various kinds. Now, this compares with reports that the Ukrainians have piled up the equivalent of 7 brigades in this area, a force supposedly constituting in strength somewhere around 10% of the Ukrainian army. Now, the size of a Ukrainian brigade is something of a mystery to me. US military brigades number around perhaps 4,000 men each. I don't think there is any possibility that at this stage in the war, Ukrainian brigades would number anything like that figure. If we halve that and think it's 2,000 men per brigade, then maybe there's 14,000 Ukrainian troops in the area, in which case they would have approximate parity with the Russians. If, on the other hand, it's more than that, let's assume that it's 3,000 men per brigade, then, well, it would be about 21,000 men, which would give them a certain numerical superiority over the Russians, but not a decisive one. Now, I would quickly add that it seems that we are not talking here so much about complete brigades. There are some complete Ukrainian brigades in this area, primarily the ones who were deployed to this area before the Russian incursion began. But as I understand it, what we're talking about, when people talk about the equivalent of 7 brigades, they're basically counting the number of battalions drawn from many different units across the contact line and are talking about brigade equivalents. Anyway, one way or the other, it is a significant force facing up against what is only a fractional part of the Russian army. And as I discussed yesterday, both President Zelensky and General Syrskyi have been talking about this force having successfully contained the Russian advances, and General Syrskyi has been talking about counterattacks. And yesterday, I saw reports on Redovka, Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, and on the military summary channel about the likelihood of Ukrainian counterattacks in both the Lipsy and Volchansk areas. And there was a very interesting discussion of these potential counterattacks on Redovka. It said that the Russian strategy, when faced with Ukrainian counterattacks, would be to dig in, to let them come, to inflict major casualties on the Ukrainians once they launch their attacks, and then to exploit the defeats of the Ukrainian counterattacks to undertake further advances. And Redovka, which clearly has some fairly knowledgeable people, has also provided a rather interesting dissection of the battle, especially for Volchansk, which squares very well with a fascinating account of these border battles that has been provided now by the commentator known to me as Big Serge. He is somebody who writes extensively about military matters. I know nothing at all about his background, other than that I believe he's based in the United States, but is an Orthodox Christian. And anyway, Big Serge has given a very interesting discussion of the fighting. He too appears to think that the battle for Volchansk is ultimately the important one. He too thinks that the Russians are most unlikely to have any serious plans to capture Kharkiv city. He also believes that one of the major purposes of the advance on Kharkiv region by the Russians is to compel the Ukrainians to redeploy forces from the contact line, the historic line of contact in Donbass, weakening Ukrainian positions in Donbass to Kharkiv's region to repel this significant, though not overwhelming, Russian force. And he also says that there's an important problem that the Ukrainians face, which is that the Russians, having captured the village of Staritsa and various other positions, and having destroyed most of the supply routes for the Ukrainian garrison into Volchansk, they're able to inflict horrific damage on Ukrainian reinforcements and supplies that travel along the only available road, available to the Ukrainians, road to Volchansk, which road is essentially controlled by Russian drones and which lies within easy range of Russian long and medium and even short-ranged artillery. And this is consistent, by the way, with everything I've been hearing about a major losses that the Ukrainians have been suffering in the Volchansk area. And it also doubtless explains by the Russians the destruction of the various bridges along the various waterways that we've been hearing so much about. The Russians are forcing the Ukrainians to funnel their supplies down one particular road, and it also is consistent with the description of the fighting in Volchansk provided by Redovka. Now, what exactly is happening, though? Lots of Ukrainian losses in Volchansk, lots of Ukrainian losses in Lipsy as well. But are the Ukrainians really counterattacking in any one of these places? Now, I asked this question because this morning I've been getting reports from various Telegram channels which look like they're reliable. They are admittedly on the Russian side, but they speak of the Russians making further advances in the Lipsy area and in the Volchansk area, also of the Russians making more advances, and of the Russians capturing another village in the Volchansk area, a village I think called Tiche, near a waterway where the Ukrainians themselves, or rather a Belarusian unit, fighting with the Ukrainians, is seen to have destroyed a bridge. So, what really is going on? And I'm going to make a suggestion that there have indeed been Ukrainian counterattacks, and the Russian Defense Ministry is saying that these Ukrainian counterattacks have been repelled, and I suspect that that perhaps is true, and I suspect that perhaps the Russians are doing exactly what Redovka said they would do, which is that they are taking advantage of the defeat of these Ukrainian counterattacks to capture, at least in some places, perhaps more in Volchansk than Lipsy, more ground. But I admit this is speculative. Fog of war, very heavy over this particular battlefield. We'll have to wait and see, and there'll need to be more clarification before very long. But anyway, in the meantime, one way or the other, there is now, I think, a growing recognition and acceptance by an increasing number of commentators that the point I've been making for some time, which is that Zelensky has overemphasized the Kharkiv front. He has deployed too many troops to this area, this secondary battlefield, perhaps believing that there is a Russian plan to capture Kharkiv, which of course the Russians themselves have denied that they're planning to do. Anyway, Zelensky has overcommitted too many troops to this area, and that he has caused grave weakness across Ukrainian positions everywhere else along the contact line as a consequence. And reports of Zelensky screaming at his generals and believing that he's not been told the truth about the battles in Kharkiv region, to my mind, tend to confirm this. He's desperate not to lose Kharkiv. In his own imagination, there is now a Russian threat to Kharkiv. He's making demands of his generals, which they have been trying to push back against, and which perhaps they see as irrational, but he has been insisting that Kharkiv must be given absolute priority over other battlefronts, even if that comes at the cost of weakening all the other front lines. And the result is that Ukrainian troops have piled up in Kharkiv region, where there are few fortifications. They're suffering horrific losses, trying to hold positions and counterattack against the far better equipped and far more thoroughly trained Russians, who perhaps have, by the way, also created some sort of fortified positions in this area, created trenches and entrenched themselves in all sorts of ways. And the result is that most of the front line has been weakened, but the Ukrainians are suffering losses, disproportionate losses in Kharkiv, to defend against a threat of a Russian advance on Kharkiv city, which perhaps does not exist. Anyway, on the topic of Kharkiv, I ought to say that yesterday the Russians bombed it again with their air force, destroyed a warehouse, which is part of a shopping complex. The smoke from this complex rose to extraordinary heights above the city. The Ukrainians say that this is a civilian location, civilian target, that there was nothing of any military significance there. The Russians say that it was used as a warehouse for more rockets and other systems. Could it perhaps also be the case that the Russians thought that this warehouse might be used either to store ATACMS missiles in the future, or perhaps that it is already being used for that purpose? Now, that, I admit, is entirely my own guess. Anyway, there we are. That's the situation in the Kharkiv region. Everywhere else, it's an accelerating Ukrainian collapse. The Ukrainians continue fighting hard in Chasiv Yar, where they still have some of their best troops. They fighting for the micro district east of the aqueduct continues at a horrific level. As I said, this is the pictures that one sees of the fighting in the micro district are horrendous. But elsewhere, it looks like the Russians have gradually occupied more and more positions. To the north of Chasiv Yar, they're now apparently in the process of clearing this village of Kalinina, which is to the north of Chasiv Yar. And there's some reports that they've reached the aqueduct to the north of Chasiv Yar and that they've entrenched themselves there. And as I've discussed already, there is ample confirmation that the Russians, having now secured their control of Klishevka and Andreevka southeast of Chasiv Yar, that they've reached the aqueduct, or expanding their control of the aqueduct, along the aqueduct in that area as well. And there are reports that they've not only crossed the aqueduct and are attacking the Novi micro-district to the west of the aqueduct, but that they've successfully repelled Ukrainian counterattacks there also. So a horrific battle is underway for Chasiv Yar, and the Russians increasingly positioned to capture Chasiv Yar itself. Now, Big Serge, in that long discussion that I discussed, which you can, by the way, find on Substack, he says that the Russians also have the possibility of advancing from Klishevka and pivoting south, linking up with their forces, marching north east from Ocheretino, and encircling Ukrainian troops in the two fortified villages of Toretsk and New York, located west of the Russian-controlled city of Gorlovka. And this is entirely possible. Many people have discussed this very same possibility. We'll have to wait and see. But anyway, battle there in Chasiv Yar and its areas. That battle appears to be absolutely horrendous. Further south, or rather further north of Chasiv Yar, we've now had reports, one of which has been confirmed by the Russian Defense Ministry, that the Russians have captured two strategic villages south of Kupiansk, in the direction of the Oskol and Zherebets River. The village of Ivanka has apparently been captured. There are apparently multitude photographs showing Russian troops there, and that most likely, therefore, is true. I've no doubt that it is true, but it seems that the Russians have also captured another village in this area called Berestovoye, which is also in this same general region, and of course the battle towards the possibility of a Russian advance towards the Oskol and Zherebets rivers now also exists. By the way, Big Serge also points out, a similar point that I've made before, that the fighting in Volchansk has a bearing on the future of Ukrainian positions in Kupiansk, and that in the event that the Russians do recapture Volchansk, Ukrainian positions in Kupiansk and ultimately Izium and Liman start to come under significant threat as well, especially if the Russians, of course, launch further advances and capture places like Siversk. And I think we've now seen photographic and film evidence that the Russians not only control the village of Belogorovka to the east of Siversk, not far from Siversk at all, by the way, but that they've also either captured or are in the process of capturing the chalk quarry, which is located immediately to the south of Belogorovka as well. And in the Ocheretino-Avdiivka area, the Russians clearly now apparently advancing of Novo-Alexandrovka, northeast of Ocheretino. There's reports that they control around half this village, which would suggest incredibly rapid progress, by the way, ultimately towards Pokrovsk and towards the highway that links Pokrovsk with Konstantinovka, the town close to Chasiv Yar, which will be the next Russian target. And, well, there's also further confirmation. The Ukrainians appear now to have accepted that they have lost the villages of Umanske and Italevo further south, and the Ukrainians have also been publishing film. So the Ukrainians themselves have been publishing film of resumed fighting in Krasnogorovka, a town to the south of Avdiivka, which suggests that the Russians are now finally moving to secure complete control of that particular fortified town. So, major crisis there. The 79th Brigade of the Ukrainian army has now conceded, it seems, that the Russians, or at least is close to conceding, the Paraskovievka, the village to the immediate east of the larger village of Konstantinovka that they're defending. That village of Paraskovievka has also about to fall. The Russians seem to be, there are reports this morning that they have actually entered Konstantinovka, the village immediately to the west of Paraskovievka. Of course, if all of these villages, Novomikhailovka having fallen a little while ago, but Paraskovievka, Konstantinovka, all of these fall, a supply road to Vuhledar gets cut off, and the Russians draw closer to the other supply roads and to the nodal town, the town which is a transport and supply hub in this area, which is Kurakovo. And there's also reports that the Russians have made further progress in the Vremivka salient, that they've perhaps close to recapturing Staromayorsk, and now control a significant part of Urozhaine. And there's even reports elsewhere that the Russians are now again advancing in Zaporozhye region along the Dnieper River northward along the east bank of the Dnieper River, perhaps creeping closer towards the city, the great city of Zaporozhye, further to the north. So anyway, one way or the other, this is a terrible picture. The Ukrainians complaining that their communications is breaking down. I discussed yesterday how the Starlink system is now only sporadically operating across Ukraine. Elon Musk apparently is sounding the alarm bells about this, and he's saying how difficult it is for him and for Starlink, for SpaceX, to deal with the Russian jamming. Reports the 79th Brigade trying to defend in Paraskovievka and Konstantinovka, these two villages in the Vuglidar area. They're saying that they lose communications through the Starlink for stretches of up to 15 hours at a time. In every part, as I said, of the front lines, the Ukrainians are being pushed back. They're suffering ever heavier losses. I discussed those yesterday. And village after village gradually coming under Russian control. Krasnogorovka, an important town, likely to fall fairly soon. Chasov Yar, perhaps that place coming under Russian control, months' time. Konstantinovka, bigger place, likely to be besieged fairly soon. And of course, ongoing fighting in Volchansk and Lipsy, and uncertainties about what the Russians might or might not be planning in Sumy region, closer to Kiev itself. The Ukrainians short of reserves, and a commentary on CNN that the Ukrainian military, the soldiers on the battlefronts, are questioning whether the latest mobilization is going to change the situation on the battlefronts. They're complaining that they're not getting enough people to replace losses and to fill the gaps. But more importantly, it seems that they're also complaining that the people they are getting are unmotivated and are unwilling to fight the Russians and abandon their positions at the moment of a Russian attack. And by the way, I mentioned that the Russians are undertaking advances along the Dnieper River, possibly, ultimately, edging towards Zaporozhye city, and there have been reports that they've taken quite a lot of prisoners in that area as well. So the whole situation remains constriction, aggressive attrition by the Russians. They've clearly moved beyond active defense. They have not, however, still launched all their forces. The military summary channel, in its latest video, has spoken about the Russians building up an enormous supply base, logistics hub in Lugansk region, which could be intended to support future offensives further west, deeper inside Ukraine. Of course, we had that tantalizing report, that's an audit report. We had those pictures of the Russians building an air base near Belgorod, in Belgorod region, which also looks like it's intended to support Russian military operations deeper inside Ukraine. And, well, the clock continues to tick. And as Lavrov says, the West is becoming more desperate and it is resorting to ever more reckless moves. Well, one other plan, I think, is now showing early signs of unraveling. This is the conference, the so-called peace conference that the Western powers, I say the Western powers, have convened in Switzerland and which is supposed to be taking place in June. Now, since August, since the time of the Ukrainian summer offensive, there has been a succession of meetings between the Western powers and various countries from the global south, which are supposed to center on discussions of Zelensky's so-called peace plan. Now, the peace plan, as I've discussed many times, that Zelensky is promoting and which the Western powers up to this point have been supporting, is not a peace plan at all. Essentially, it requires the Russians to withdraw all their troops from Ukraine, from every part of pre-2014 Ukraine. That includes, of course, Crimea. And once they have done that, negotiations are supposed to take place between Russia and Ukraine, though apparently these negotiations are conditional on Putin himself stepping down, just saying. Anyway, and the idea is that these negotiations are going to be centered around such topics as war crimes trials for Russian leaders, payment of reparations by Russia for Ukraine, to Ukraine, and things like that. And Zelensky, apparently to the exasperation of some Western officials and to the dismay of some Ukrainian officials as well, is absolutely adamant on sticking to this plan. Anyway, this plan, in my opinion, was drawn up at the end of 2022, the beginning of 2023, based on the assumption that Ukraine's 2023 summer offensive would end in victory, that the Ukrainians would break through to the Sea of Azov, that Crimea would be, in effect, encircled, and that the Western powers and Ukraine would at that point be in a position to dictate terms to the Russians. And the idea was to get the global south to unite behind this proposal so that the Russians, if they had any ideas of continuing the war, would find that they had no diplomatic support and would be forced, in effect, to capitulate. In the event, things have turned out completely differently. The Russians comprehensively defeated Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive. It ended in total disaster. The Russians have been on the offensive ever since. They've gained important ground, and there is no sign that their offensive is losing momentum. In fact, in my opinion, it is actually gaining momentum. More and more Ukrainian positions are being lost. Ukraine is suffering ever heavier losses. And as we've seen, the Western powers are resorting to ever more reckless steps. Well, nonetheless, that diplomatic initiative, which began in August, as sometimes happens, has rumbled on and we've had a series of inconclusive meetings in which countries from the global south have come back and have told Western participants, this simply isn't realistic. You've got to talk to the Russians. You've got to invite the Russians to these meetings. And Zelensky's plan is a completely unrealistic one. Well, nonetheless, unsurprisingly, the West has continued with this process. And it seems that a final gamble was made to try to win Global South opinion to this plan by getting the Swiss to organize this conference. Switzerland, purportedly a neutral power, in fact, the emblematic neutral power. So the idea is that if they set up a peace conference, then they must be acting in some kind of even-handed way. And of course, the Swiss spread the story that this time they were actually inviting the Russians to this conference. Except, of course, it turned out otherwise. Firstly, Switzerland, as the Russians never failed to point out, has jeopardized its neutrality, its status as a neutral power. In fact, the Russians no longer treat Switzerland as a neutral power. They say that Switzerland has not only endorsed every Western position on the Ukrainian conflict, but by supplying weapons to Ukraine, which it has done, even if indirectly, and by joining in Western sanctions against Russia, can no longer be considered a neutral state. So that's what the Russians have been saying about Switzerland. They've also said that, contrary to the story that the Swiss at one time spread, they have never been invited to this peace conference, or at least not properly invited to this peace conference. Lavrov explained it all at some length a few weeks ago in an interview he gave, and I have seen no Western official contradict him. He said that the Swiss foreign minister told him that Russia would indeed be asked to attend this peace conference, but it would not be attending the actual plenary sessions. It would only participate, only be allowed to participate in the very last meeting of the conference, when the other countries attending had reached a consensus, which would then be presented to the Russians as the united position of most of the world. Well, Lavrov at that point said that in that case he was not interested. The Russians were not interested and would not go. Anyway, without the Russians going, and with Lavrov and the Russians warning various countries about the peace conference, it looks as if the peace conference is, well, I'm not saying it's fallen apart, a peace conference or so-called peace conference of some kind will take place in Switzerland, but it looks as if it's not going to deliver on the expectations of the Western powers. Firstly, the Russians, as I said, are not attending. China, some time ago, made clear that it would not attend either. Then, to complicate and dismay matters even further, the Russians, as the chair of the BRICS states this year, convened a conference of BRICS foreign ministers, which is to take place in parallel with the conference in Switzerland. The Chinese foreign minister Wang Yi has confirmed that he is attending, and it is likely that other foreign ministers of the BRICS countries will attend as well. China and Brazil, in the meantime, have had a meeting and have discussed Ukraine, and they have come to a view that they share positions on Ukraine, and they are now talking about convening a peace conference of their own, which will include the Russians and which is clearly intended as a real or alternative peace conference to the one that is supposed to happen in Switzerland. India has apparently said that it will send a delegate to the peace conference in Switzerland because India wants to participate in that conference, or at least to state the consensus of the global south, as the Indians always like to say. But I suspect that Foreign Minister Jaishankar is more likely to attend the meeting that the Russians, the BRICS meeting, that the Russians are going to convene. But we will have to wait and see what it is exactly that the Indians do intend to do. So this peace conference is starting to crumble around its edges. And Chancellor Scholz of Germany, as I discussed some days ago, has said that expectations of what will come from this peace conference should not be placed too high. There is unlikely to be a full international consensus reached on the way forward, though it may be that some positions can be agreed broadly on the more uncontroversial matters, humanitarian access, and that sort of thing. Now, why have I discussed all of this? I mean, why is it important to talk about the fact that this conference, I believe it's going to happen in Geneva, is starting to crumble away? Firstly, I think that this is the last real throw the Biden administration has, this particular conference, on achieving some kind of international consensus about Ukraine that might impress the Russians. It's now increasingly clear that that isn't going to happen, and President Biden himself, with the administration perhaps sensing a debacle, has apparently now said that he is staying away. He will not attend this conference, and it looks as if none of the heads of state or governments of the BRIC states intend to go either, though we will again have to wait and see. It's always possible that people like MBS, for example, might turn up there, though I doubt that, as I said, his presence is going to make any substantive difference. But anyway, we will see. But again, this story is important for two reasons. Firstly, it is a sign of how the West is losing its once undisputed mastery of the diplomatic agenda. It once was able to set the diplomatic agenda, hammer out proposals, get widespread acceptance for them, present them as in the form of ultimatums or demands backed by an international consensus, present them to the adversary party. That is no longer the case, and we've seen that start to happen in the Middle East, where the Arab League, backed by China, and before long, and now Russia, are touting an international peace conference of their own to settle the Gaza crisis without, apparently, the United States taking the central role. And we see that when the United States and the Western powers, using Switzerland, have tried to set up a peace conference of their own relating to the Ukraine crisis, this has failed. And this affair has also had the effect of triggering a further deterioration in Chinese-US relations. The United States has reacted extremely negatively to the announcement that Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, intends to participate in the BRICS Foreign Ministers Summit meeting in Russia rather than the Ukraine Peace Conference in Switzerland. The State Department has, one of its top officials, has come out and said that this proves that China is, to all intents and purposes, a party to the conflict in Ukraine on Russia's side, and this must stop. How the United States can get China to stop is, of course, an entirely different matter. But it shows the extent to which the Americans have been angered once more by what the Chinese are going to do. Well, there it is. If the US and the Western powers had achieved mastery over Russia in the military conflict and or in the economic war, then it would be different. But what the Western powers are trying to do, or have been trying to do, is use diplomacy, at which, by the way, they're not very good at, to try to retrieve diplomatically what they have lost or are losing in the economic and military battles. And it is unrealistic in today's world to think that such a thing is possible. If your hard power isn't working, then it's foolish to think that your objectives, your maximalist objectives, can be achieved in this way. Anyway, there we are. We will see whether or not who exactly does attend this conference in Switzerland. But all the signs are that it has now been marginalized in importance. Even Western governments apparently think so. The British, of course, the party that will attend will be the new government that comes into power following the British general election. Or rather, it won't be, because, of course, the British general election happens on the 4th of July. So the current Conservative government, likely to lose that election, most unlikely, in my opinion, to be very interested in the peace conference in Geneva also. So anyway, one way or the other, all of the strings of power are now starting to slip out of the Biden administration's hands. Now, the United States is still the greatest power in the world. The BRICS are becoming a mighty force. Their aggregate industrial and raw material resources are greater, but the United States still retains enormous amounts of hard power. But this whole Ukraine affair and this story of the conference in Switzerland ought to show again that it is overestimating the power that it has, and that it is not making the correct decisions, the realistic decisions that it needs to make if peace is to be achieved. Now, in Minsk, and several times in many fora, Putin has said what for him the basis of the negotiations would be. He said that the starting point has to be Istanbul, but of course it must go beyond Istanbul. there must be discussions, there must be acceptance by Ukraine that the 4 regions are now Russian. That is non-negotiable. There has to be recognition, in other words, of the situation on the ground. And recently, in discussions with the Xinhua news agency, he also made clear that the security framework in Europe needs to be reconsidered. Putin spoke of what Putin has discussed, I have described as Istanbul Plus. He has also cast doubt on President Zelensky's legitimacy and on President Zelensky's ability to remain, to participate in negotiations, given that, as far as the Russians are concerned, there are now questions about whether any agreement the Russians make with him has any legal validity. Well, what Putin hinted about there has now been spelled out in the clearest way by the Speaker of the State Duma, the lower house of Russia's parliament, Vyacheslav Volodin. And today, on his Telegram channel, Volodin said the following: by cancelling the presidential election, Zelensky has usurped power. Starting on May 21st, Zelensky has completely lost the remnants of his pseudo-legitimacy. Any agreements with an illegitimate president are null and void and may be challenged in the future. As his presidential office term expired, Putin no longer has expired. Zelensky no longer has the right to speak on behalf of the Ukrainian people. So the Russians have clearly signaled that part of what they also want to see in Ukraine now is a change of regime. Maybe even imposed regime change. Well, Putin, of course, has been talking about that for some, or rather, other officials in Russia, Medvedev, for example, have been talking about that for a long time. But Putin has now, in effect, said as much. He's waited for the expiry of Zelensky's term. And Volodin, the Speaker of the Duma, has now made it explicit. Zelensky must go. That is a minimum requirement if there is to be peace. Who is to take his place? Well, of course, Putin and the Russians are not saying. But an interesting visitor arrived in Minsk whilst Putin and Lukashenko were having their summit meeting there. That was Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, who was overthrown in the Maidan events of February 2014 and who is in exile in Russia and who the Russians have at various times suggested was the last fully legitimate, fully constitutional president of Ukraine, given that he was elected and held power in accordance with the Ukrainian constitution and was elected to that office as a result of universally recognized elections and was overthrown, as the Russians would say, unconstitutionally through the mechanism of a coup. Could it be that the Russians are now soon going to say that the only means to achieve peace in Ukraine is by restoring legal and constitutional legality, and that can only be done if Yanukovych, the last legitimate president of Ukraine, is reinstalled in that position, upon which point the Russians can agree with him the terms of peace, a peace based on Istanbul Plus. Well, it's an interesting thought. I'd be very curious to know whom exactly Yanukovych was talking to whilst he was in Minsk, and what, if anything, he might have said and perhaps agreed to. Let's wait and see. This is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget that you can also check out our shop. Get yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.